Welcome to Train Signal. You're watching a lesson on expansion cards. Now, when it comes to expansion cards, really what we need to talk about is if we think back to the motherboards lesson, we talked about expansion slots. Well, this lesson is going to be kind of a short and to the point lesson where we're going to talk about all the different types of cards that we can put into those slots. Now, before we get into the different types of cards, there is one thing I would like to point out, and that is that this expansion capability, although in the old days it was always in the form of cards in slots, right? So we actually had a separate adapter card. We now have two options. In some cases, we'll have integrated chips on the motherboard for all these various things that we're going to take a look at. There could be a chip on the motherboard that kind of hardwires the functionality right into the motherboard, and then we'll have the circuitry, and then we'll just have a port on the back of the motherboard for that functionality. Or we still can move to a separate adapter card. So the first type of card that I'd like to talk about is video cards. All right, I'd say these are pretty important. Right, video cards are what make it that you can connect a monitor and actually see what's happening on the computer. If you can't see what's happening, does it really happen? It's got to be a joke there somewhere. But anyway, let's take a look at video cards. This is an example of one. First thing I suppose I should point out is you'll notice that it almost looks like a little mini motherboard in the sense that there's this thing called the GPU, or the Graphics Processing Unit. It looks like I'm pointing to a fan, which of course, just like when we looked at the CPU on the motherboard, the Central Processing Unit, again, we had to have some kind of cooling mechanism. Well, that is a form of a processor. Because video is so resource intensive, it needs so much data to produce video, it typically has its own processor. Now, sometimes this processor, sometimes this GPU, will be on the video card itself. In some cases, it'll actually be integrated in with the CPU. Okay, some CPU manufacturers, and there's only two, I know we talked about Intel and AMD, but certain models, I'll say, of those CPUs have an integrated GPU to help out with video, especially if the video is going to be integrated onto the motherboard. All right, so that's what that is. It's an actual processor. From there, there's also separate video memory. All right, so it's like we're talking about RAM, but it's RAM specifically for video processing. Again, video is so resource intensive. There's so much data that is involved and so much calculations that's involved. It has its own processor and its own memory. We have the bus connector at the bottom, right? These are the little circuits that go into the slot. And then on the outside of the card, and when I say outside, it's the part of the card that would end up being outside the back of the box that the computer's in. You have the actual display connectors. Now, speaking of the display connectors, I have illustrated here three of the most common connectors that you will see in today's computers. And the one on the left is a VGA connector. It is typically blue. It actually looks a lot like the 9-pin serial connector, something I know we haven't really talked about, but it resembles that in shape and size. But there's actually 15 pins, 3 rows of 5 that you can see there. In the middle there, we have an HDMI port, right? And that's for our high def, right? We see HDMI ports on all of our high def TVs. Okay, so that's an HDMI port there. And then we have our DVI, which is also digital, and it's also used for a lot of the high resolution stuff. Okay, and that's that white connector that we have there. These are the three most common video card display connectors that we would use to connect a monitor into the card so that we can actually get something to display on it. So now let's move into multimedia cards. And the main thing that we think of when we think of multimedia is sound, right? We think of our sound cards, right? And sound cards, are used so that you can plug in speakers and get sound, right? You can hear things out of the computer. But besides the speakers, well, what else do we have? Well, if you take a look, this is a real advanced sound card. Now, not all sound cards come with all these different ports on them. But basically, this one has line out, right, where you can hook up a stereo. You have rear out, center out. Now, a lot of them just plain have speaker out. Okay, and it's usually greenish in color. Okay, so the green you see around the line out hole there, that's the color you're looking for. If you just have traditional computer speakers, you'll notice the jack very often that you're plugging in is going to also be that same greenish color so that you can match it up. All right, but if you did have this advanced system, you can hook up the stereo, you can hook up the rear speakers if you want surround sound. You have center out for center speaker, sub. Again, if you're going to have a complete, surround sound system from your computer, which some systems do, especially if you're doing like DJ work and stuff like that from your computer, then you might have this type of a sound card. Mic is another big one. Mic in, where you'll have this pinkish color. That's where you hook up a microphone for sound in. So for instance, the computer I'm on right now, it has a sound card, and I only have two things plugged in. I have the little green wire plugged in for my speakers so that I can hear sounds out of my computer. And I have the pink one, which is for a microphone, which I'm speaking to you right now through. Okay, so that's pretty much what I have there. And then you also have line in if you wanted to go ahead and have some kind of a device that you want to port the sound in from. So I'm just kind of giving you a little example there of like a little iPod or something, so that you want to pipe sound into the computer. But there are other types of multimedia cards besides just sound. Okay, you have your TV tuner cards. Okay, and I've kind of put it together here as also video capture cards. They're actually very similar. Sometimes one and the same. The idea behind a TV tuner card, and this is very cool, I always think. I actually don't have one in my computer right now, and I'd like to add one. It's a great way to be able to get some kind of a television feed into your computer so you can actually watch TV on your computer monitors. Right? So, when I'm working and I'm doing all this and all that, and I have a multiple monitor system and I can look at all these different things on different windows, it'd be nice if one of the windows could be television. Now, the need is not there for me as much anymore now that we have different streaming broadcasts across the internet. When there's like breaking news or something, lots of times you can watch television via the internet. But it's still nice to, sometimes have actual broadcast television coming through on your computer. And so you can do that with this type of a card. You'll notice there is the coaxial hookup, which would be for your cable or your satellite to feed a signal in and have an actual tuner to be able to produce television on your computer. The video capture aspect of it is if you want to go ahead and be able to record. Okay, so DVR boxes are real popular, right? TiVo is a name that was real popular. Now it's just DVR, right? And digital video recorder. And yeah, it's another great way to kind of make your own DVR by having a TV tuner / video capture card so that you can not only watch television on the computer, but you can also record television on the computer. Very cool stuff. Now, I have this next section listed as interface, and I thought about breaking it into two different sections because this just has to do with various types of interfaces. The first types that we have here, it's hard to classify these. The second section that we're going to get into is going to have to do with network interface. Okay, but they're all interfaces of some kind. Now here I have an example of, I'm not really showing you the cards themselves. I'm showing you what's more typical, which would be that you have actual onboard chips. So you have your keyboard and mouse all the way on the left, and these are what's known as PS2 connectors. This is somewhat outdated. More often than not, we will connect our keyboards and mice via USB. And part of the reason why is because the PS2 keyboard and mouse, they weren't hot swappable, meaning you couldn't plug them in live. The other thing is that very often they were specific. The green one on top is specific to the mouse, and the purple one on the bottom is specific to the keyboard. Okay, so you kind of had to have those correct, whereas now you can just plug them into any USB port and you're fine. Up at the top, we have a parallel port, which is a very old data port that is almost never used anymore. Down near the bottom, we have the serial port. Remember how I mentioned how the serial port kind of resembles that VGA port in size and shape? But you'll notice the serial port's only 9 pins, and it's a male port that uses a female connector, as opposed to the video was a female port with a male connector. Over on the right, we have FireWire and USB, which are also forms of data interfaces, but much more common and more up-to-date interfaces than our parallel and our serial. Now again, this stuff is usually built right into the motherboard on board, and then you just have the ports out the back of your computer. But you do have the ability to buy expansion cards that you can put into your, your PCI slots, your PCIe slots, things like that, to add additional FireWire USB ports. Those would probably be the more typical ones. Now this is where I could break into the other half of, the kind of interfaces 2A, or 2B or whatever. I guess it would be 2 or B, right? The second part, and where we have, different forms of networking. Now the first one I have here is kind of out of date. You don't really see this anymore. This would be a modem. Traditional dial-up modem. Uses the regular phone line. Those are RJ11 connectors in the back. Uses regular telephone cable, and you max out pretty much at 56K as far as the throughput. Now I will also tell you that if you look at this card, you see how there's 2 of these RJ11 jacks, right? It doesn't typically mean that there's 2 modems. Okay, matter of fact, there is such a thing as a dual modem card, but the reality is that typically you're just going to have 1 modem chip on this card, and the reason we have 2 RJ11 jacks is because, well, if you kind of put yourself back into a day and age where landline phones were prominent, okay, and we didn't all have cell phones, and we only had a certain number of jacks that were wired, whether it was at home or at the office, it doesn't matter, and we didn't want to have somebody have to come out and rewire an additional jack at each desk, let's say. Okay, let's put ourselves in an office environment. At each desk, there's a phone jack, right? So that you can have a telephone. Now you want to have a modem from the computer. Well, you don't want to have a second jack installed. So what we have here in this card is kind of a pass-through type situation, where one of the jacks would be labeled line in, and this is where you would actually hook the modem up to the line in the wall. Okay, so the jack in the wall would then connect into this particular card in the line in jack. And then in the other jack, it would say phone. And by the way, very often it wouldn't even say the words. There'd be little icons showing you. And so it'd be like a little picture of a telephone or a handset. But anyway, that jack is specifically so that you could still plug your telephone in somewhere and still use it to make phone calls. Okay, so it would connect the wiring and pass right through this particular modem card. Right, so that's what you would typically find on a lot of the modem cards that were out there. We have network interface card, or NIC, which is, and this is an example of a wired NIC, where that's an RJ45 jack in the back for Ethernet cable, so that you can connect to networks, which is very common not just in the business environment, but also in the home environment, where you'll have your own little home network, plug into your own little home router, maybe connects to the cable or DSL internet. And if you look carefully at this card, and actually same with the card before it, and you'll find this on most of your network cards, whether it's wired or wireless, you'll see there's these 2 little dots, these 2 little round circles that are in the back, and those are actually lights. Okay, those are little LED lights. Typically they will be green and amber. And amber is kind of a flavor of orange. Sometimes they'll even just make it truly just yellow. But what these lights typically represent, and there's a few different things, and sometimes you'll even see 3 of them. One light may represent just pure connectivity, just saying that the card is connected to a network. Another light is typically showing activity. Okay, so when there is data that is traveling to or from this particular computer that has this card in it, okay, so if there's data traveling in and out of this card, you'll see one of the lights flicker. Sometimes you'll even see the same light where you'll see one light that lights up solid just to say it's connected, and then that light will flicker as data is traveling. And there is actually the third one that you'll sometimes see, and that one is just sometimes just to show that there's power. Okay, just that the card is actually plugged into, I mean in this case it's It's a little unusual because it's an internal expansion card, and if it's in the slot, it's going to have power. But that's still something that you may want to see. You may want to see that the card has power itself. So that's what those lights are for. I guess one other thing I could tell you that as long as we're talking about the lights, is sometimes you'll see a series of these little lights based upon different speeds. Sometimes you'll have a card that is capable of transmitting at 10 megabits per second. Okay, so it works on 10 megabit Ethernet, or maybe 100 megabit Ethernet, and these days even gigabit Ethernet. And so you may see different lights for the different speeds, and then that light, again, sometimes you see it just lit solid, and that means that you are connected to that type of network. And then other times you'll see either a different light or even the same light flickering if there's data being transmitted at that speed. And that's what that network card is for. Or sometimes we'll even have wireless networking communication, okay, where you have a card. You'll notice there's just an antenna sticking out the back, so we can have wireless communication to the network. And then we even have cellular, and you'll notice that goes with the little mini PCI for our laptops. It's not very common you're going to put a cellular card into a desktop. Why use cellular if you're not moving anywhere? It's not completely unheard of, but not very common either. Okay, so these are all the various types of network interface adapters. And then we get to our storage cards, where one example would be for something called SCSI. Okay, SCSI stands for Small Computer System Interface. It is a type of storage technology where we can have SCSI hard drives, and you can have an adapter that you put in the card. And I want to point out that with this particular card, sometimes you have external connections, but sometimes you also can have internal connections. In this case, you can have internal or external SCSI hard drives. And here we have a SATA storage adapter, okay, where, again, the one on the left, it's interesting. All I'm doing is I'm adding 4 SATA ports, so that means 4 more SATA hard drives. I know that's a separate lesson where we'll talk about the different actual types of hard drives. Don't worry about that for right now, but once you understand what that is, if you have a need to put more hard drives in your computer, you can actually put one of these expansion ports in, and there'll be nothing on the outside. Whereas on the right side of this picture here, I show an example of another SATA expansion adapter where you have one more on the inside, but you also have something called eSATA for external SATA on the outside. Okay, so if you want to have an external SATA hard drive. Now, another type of storage card that's very similar to what we've just looked at with both the SCSI and the SATA cards would be a RAID controller card. Okay, and so it's going to allow for multiple connections as far as multiple SCSI devices, multiple SATA devices. Obviously, with SCSI, everything is daisy chained anyway. But this particular card is designed to offer hardware RAID. Now, I'm not going to go into great detail here about RAID because that's something we're going to talk about in a different lesson where we actually talk about storage. Okay, so I'll go into the details of RAID and how it works. But the idea is where you take an array, which, by the way, RAID stands for Redundant Array of Independent Disks. So it'll kind of make sense here. You have an array of these independent, smaller disks all working together for one area of storage. So I'll give you that one little teaser before we get into the storage lesson where I talk about it in detail. But sometimes you'll see those storage cards as well. Now, the one last type of expansion card that I want to talk about is something called a riser card, and we really don't see this much anymore. The idea behind these riser cards, or what's also sometimes referred to as a daughter board, is in the older days, and it's not to say that we don't have any of this anymore, but it was more common in the older days. Instead of having that tower type computer case, we actually had something that was called a desktop computer case, where the computer actually laid horizontal and it would go under your monitor, right? You'd put your monitor on the computer case. And so since the computer was laying sideways and it was a very slimline type model, what we had to do was we couldn't fit the expansion cards in vertically the way the slots were originally designed. So these daughter boards or riser cards were designed to basically extend the expansion slot up and then perpendicular with the original slot, as you can see here with the PCI slot being given as the example here. Again, you don't see it as much anymore because you don't see as much of today's slimline desktop computers. Although you do, in some cases, even have a slimline tower computer. But some of those, with some of the cards they have these days, they're also slimline cards. They're half-height cards instead of having to go to these riser cards to make it perpendicular to all fit in. But anyway, yeah, I want to make sure you know what they are in case you get asked about them. Maybe you see an old computer. And again, I always like for you to understand some of the history about how things used to be. But that does pretty much take us to the end. Or I won't even say pretty much. It does take us to the end. It got to be definitive there. It takes us to the end of this lesson. And again, kind of short, to the point. Talk to you about the different types of expansion cards, to the different peripherals that we can add to our computer systems. And these are all peripherals. These are all components that are going to connect into the motherboard somehow. And that's why we have to have some form of expansion card or expansion chip. So, that's it. I thank you for watching the lesson, and I will see you in the next one.